was late spring, and I had just finished my shift at the diner. The clock read 11:30 p.m. as I stepped outside, the air still warm from the day's heat. I didn't mind the late walks home. It was a peaceful neighborhood, mostly quiet, with the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I made my way down the street, I started to hear faint noises behind me, nothing too alarming at first, just the sound of gravel crunching underfoot. I glanced back, but only saw the empty sidewalk. Shaking it off, I continued my walk, trying to focus on the stars above. About halfway home, I heard a louder sound, like a branch snapping. I stopped and looked back again, a chill creeping down my spine. Still nothing. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was just my imagination. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows that danced eerily along the pavement. Just a few minutes later, I heard footsteps again. Closer this time. I turned around, and this time, I saw a figure a few yards behind me. A man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured. My heart raced, and I instinctively crossed to the other side of the street. I kept walking, glancing back occasionally, but the figure stayed just far enough behind that I couldn't make out any details. The distance felt both comforting and terrifying. He could easily follow me without me noticing until it was too late. As I neared a corner, I heard him pick up his pace. My heart dropped. I turned and started to jog, thinking if I could just make it to the main road, I'd be safe. But as I turned the corner, I glanced back again, and he was running too, coming straight for me. I sprinted, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, growing louder. My mind raced as I spotted a small convenience store ahead, its neon sign flickering in the dark. I bolted towards it, praying I'd make it inside. I burst through the glass door, gasping for breath. The cashier looked up, startled. "Are you okay?" he asked, but I couldn't respond. I glanced back out the door, hoping to see the man stop, but he just stood outside, his face partially hidden in shadows. "Call the police," I shouted, my voice trembling. The cashier nodded and reached for the phone as I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. The man stood still for a moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by fear of what could have happened if I hadn't made it inside. The police arrived shortly after, but by then, the man was long gone. They took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area. As I left the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly sinister. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying the events in my mind. I learned that even in familiar places, darkness can hide the unknown, and sometimes the quiet streets can harbor a lurking danger. It was a chilly October night, and the wind howled outside like a lost soul. My family was scattered throughout the house. My dad was in the den, engrossed in a game. My mom was upstairs reading, and my little brother was in the living room watching cartoons. I loved the cozy feeling of being indoors while the storm raged outside. That calmness shattered when I heard a loud banging on the front door. I paused, my heart racing. I glanced at the clock. It was past 10 p.m. Who could be at our door this late? I peeked out the window but only saw the dark outline of trees swaying in the wind. The banging came again, louder this time. Almost desperate, my brother glanced over at me, wide-eyed. "What is that?" he asked. "I don't know," I whispered back. Feeling uneasy, I made my way to the door and looked through the peephole. The sight that greeted me froze my blood. A man was standing there, drenched from the rain, his hair wild and eyes wide with panic. He was looking right at me, his face twisted in fear. "Let me in, please. I need help," he shouted, his voice breaking. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. My brother began to whimper, and I quickly ran back to him. "Stay here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I hurried to find my dad, who had just come into the hallway, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at my worried face. "There's a man outside. He's asking to come in," I said, glancing back at the door. My dad frowned, his instincts kicking in. "Let me see," he said, walking toward the door. I grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait, what if he's dangerous?"
Time.
My dad paused, considering my words. Just then, the phone rang, piercing the tense silence. I watched as my dad picked it up, his expression shifting to concern. "No, you're kidding," he said, his voice low. He listened intently for a moment before hanging up. "Stay away from the door," he ordered, moving toward the window instead. I felt a knot in my stomach as I heard him mutter under his breath. "It can't be him." "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That man, he's not who he says he is," my dad replied grimly. "He's wanted for assault. Stay put." Suddenly, the banging started again, more frantic this time. "Please, I'm being chased," the man shouted, his voice filled with terror. My brother clutched my arm tightly. My dad picked up the phone again and called the police. "There's a man at my door." "Yes, he's acting erratically," he said, glancing at me and my brother. "Please hurry." "Nay." Just as he hung up, the banging stopped. We all listened in the silence that followed, breaths held. My dad peeked through the curtains, his face paling. "He's gone," he said slowly, "but that doesn't mean it's over." "Nay." We waited, every creak of the house making us jump. Minutes felt like hours until we finally heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the police arrived and began searching the area, we learned that the man had been terrorizing several homes that night, claiming he was being hunted. They found him hiding in a nearby shed, clutching a knife. It wasn't until later that we discovered he had been diagnosed with severe mental health issues and had escaped from a nearby facility. The thought of him knocking at our door, desperate and unhinged, haunted me for weeks. That night taught me a lesson about trust, safety, and the unpredictable nature of the world around us. Sometimes, even in your own home, danger can knock at your door when you least expect it. When I was around 10 years old, I had a routine that I loved. Every Saturday, I would stay up late watching cartoons while my parents went to bed early. The living room was my sanctuary, filled with the glow of the TV and the occasional rustle of snacks. One particular night, I was deeply engrossed in an episode when I thought I heard my dad call my name from the hallway. I turned the volume down and called back, "What?" But there was no response. I shrugged it off and returned to my show, only to hear it again. "Come here." It sounded just like my dad, curious and a bit confused. I got up and walked toward the hallway. As I stepped out of the living room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The house was eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy. I called for my dad again, but all I got was silence. Then, from the shadows of the hallway, I heard his voice once more. "Come here, now." This time it was more insistent, almost urgent. I hesitated, a knot forming in my stomach. I crept further down the hall, the darkness feeling oppressive around me. As I reached the end of the hallway, the voice echoed again, softer this time. "Please, come here." A wave of dread washed over me. I didn't want to go any further, but I felt compelled to respond. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaky. Suddenly, my mom's voice called from the kitchen, breaking the spell. "What are you doing? Come back here." I felt an immediate rush of relief. I turned around quickly, but something pulled at my heart. The moment I turned my back to the hallway, I heard a low whisper, "Just a little closer." Bah. I bolted back to the living room, my heart racing. I could still hear the whisper, lingering in my ears. I jumped onto the couch, wrapping myself in a blanket, too scared to turn the lights off. After a few minutes, my parents came into the living room, their faces filled with concern. "Are you okay?" my mom asked. I recounted what had happened, but they exchanged skeptical glances. My dad patted my back, trying to reassure me. "It was just your imagination. Buddy, you're tired." But deep down, I knew what I heard. The voice had sounded so real. The feeling of dread lingered in the air, but my parents eventually convinced me to go to bed. That night, I lay wide awake under my covers, every creak of the house making me jump. I eventually fell asleep, but the whispers haunted my dreams. Years later, I asked my mom about that night. She looked at me with a serious expression. "You weren't the only one who heard something," she admitted. "That night, I kept hearing a voice calling your name from the hallway, too." The realization sent chills down my spine. To this day, I wonder what was in that hallway, whispering and beckoning me, and if it ever truly left. It was a rainy October evening, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The streets were slick, and the heavy clouds overhead threatened another downpour. As I approached a particularly dark stretch of road, I noticed a car parked on the side, its hazard lights flashing. I hesitated, but ultimately decided to stop and see if they needed help. After all, it was late, and I wouldn't want anyone stranded out here alone. As I pulled up behind the car, I saw a man standing next to it, looking anxious. He was drenched from the rain, and I could barely see his face in the dim light. "Need a hand?" I called out, rolling down my window. "Yeah, my car broke down. I could use a jump," he replied, glancing nervously down the road. I couldn't see anyone else around, which felt strange, but I shrugged it off. "Okay, I can help with that," I said, getting out of my car and grabbing my jumper cables from the trunk. As I approached his vehicle, I noticed it was an older model, and the windows were tinted dark. He pointed to his battery, and I started connecting the cables. "I really appreciate this. Man, you're a lifesaver," he said, his voice shaky. "No problem at all," I replied, trying to keep things light despite the eerie atmosphere. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced up to see him watching me intently, his expression unreadable. A creeping sense of unease settled in my stomach. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded over me, and I turned to wave to the approaching car, but when I looked back, the man was gone. My heart raced as I scanned the area. "Hey, where'd you go?" I called out, panic setting in. I felt exposed and vulnerable standing alone in the rain. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted movement. The man was crouching behind his car, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I took a step back, ready to run. Just then, the headlights of the approaching car swung toward me, illuminating the scene. The man quickly stood up, but instead of coming toward me, he sprinted away into the darkness. My instincts kicked in, and I dashed back to my car, locking the doors behind me. The car that had approached was a police vehicle. The officer stepped out, looking concerned. "Is everything okay?" I told him what had just happened, my voice shaking. He radioed for backup and approached the area where the man had disappeared. As I sat in my car, waiting for them to return, I realized how close I had come to a dangerous situation. The officer came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. "We couldn't find anyone," he said, but he offered to escort me home. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I learned that night that sometimes, offering help can lead you into the darkest situations. Always trust your instincts, even when you think you're doing the right thing.